Welcome to part 3, the final part for our 35mm focal length for the SLR Lounge Canon Lens Wars series. Now, because we had 8 lenses in this focal length grouping, in the first video we compared just the 35mm primes. In part 2, we compared the 6 different zoom lenses that covered the 35mm focal length. And finally, in this video, we're going to compare our favorites from both part 1 and part 2 to come up with kind of a final conclusion. For those that are new to the SLR Lounge Canon Lens Wars series, be sure to check out the actual teaser video where we introduce the overall series, we talk about our testing methodology and the overall purpose, and check out the other videos as well on all of the other focal lengths. This is the 35mm focal length conclusion, where we had 8 total lenses that fit into the 35mm grouping, and in the last video we reviewed the 6 zoom lenses that kind of cross over to the 35mm focal length, and we came up with the 2470 f2.8 Mark II as basically our favorite zoom lens in terms of the overall aesthetic quality, the bokeh, the sharpness, clarity, and everything. And in a close second was the 2470 f4, this guy's little brother, which is also a great value option as well. Now in our prime category, we have the 35mm primes, we have the 35mm f2. This is the IS version, but there's also a non-IS version, which is a couple $100 cheaper. And we also have the 35mm 1.4L. Here is our professional series prime. All right, so in this video, we're going to compare all 3 of these lenses against each other and see exactly what the differences are and overall what our favorite is. So let's start from the top with their WOAs, or their wide open apertures. Now, once again, this is a visual test of the difference and not a technical one. So we're trying to distinguish the differences in their appearance while viewing the images full screen on a 27-inch 3K resolution display. So aesthetically, how do they all look at their respective WOAs, or their wide open apertures? Well, expectedly, the 35mm 1.4L does have quite a bit more bokeh at 1.4 than compared to, say, the 2470, which is at 2.8. But compared to the 35mm at f2, well, they're very kind of similar. And although, like we said, if you flip back and forth, you can tell the difference, they are quite similar. But this does have a smoother and creamier look to the background than, say, the f2, and it has a much different look than the 2470 at 35mm in f2.8. But here's the interesting thing. It was really difficult to tell the difference between the 35mm f2 and the 2470 f2.8 at their WOAs. Both had a beautiful look and nearly the same amount of bokeh in the background. And you can see basically how similar they are when we compare the area of, say, like the tree trunk in both images. It's really tough to tell which has more bokeh or which has a better aesthetic until you zoom in, and even when zoomed in, it doesn't necessarily look like the 35mm f2 has any more bokeh, it just has a different look to the bokeh. And frankly, I still kind of prefer the 2470's bokeh over the 35 f2. But that, at this point, is really just a subjective preference. Now, in terms of sharpness, all 3 of these images appear to be quite sharp when viewing them full screen on our 3K display. Although I can still tell a small difference where basically the 35mm 1.4L is just a bit softer than the 35 f2 and the 2470 at their respective WOAs. We start noticing these differences even more though when we zoom in. Once again, the 35 1.4 at 1.4, the 35mm 2.0 at 2.0, and the 2470 at 2.8, it is quite easy to see that the 2470 is the sharpest of the 3 when wide open. The 35 f2 is slightly behind the 2470, and the 35L is a little bit behind both of these other 2 lenses when wide open at f1.4. But with all 3 of their lenses at their widest common aperture, their WCA of f2.8, we see the primes edge out the 2470 f2.8 ever so slightly. It is a little bit more noticeable when we zoom in, particularly over, say, the dress detail, and between the 2 35mm primes though, it's a little bit more difficult to tell which is exactly sharper, even when zoomed in. But the difference in sharpness is there as you move towards the edge of the frame, where again, the 1.4 shows better edge sharpness. And again, when it comes to overall sharpness, all 3 of these lenses are pretty dang solid. All 3 are completely usable when wide open, especially when being viewed from a normal size. But the primes do start to pull ahead once you do get past, say, f2.8. When comparing the lenses' aesthetics at their widest common apertures though, they look almost the same in terms of the overall bokeh. And remember, we're at f2.8 for their WCA. But I still end up preferring the 24-70 at f2.8, simply because the 2470 has a bit more vivid contrast, a bit better color overall, and overall their lens vignetting and barrel distortion is quite comparable as well. Okay, now if you remember when we were comparing the two 35mm primes against one another, I said that I'd recommend one of the versions of the 35mm f2 if you didn't absolutely need the extra stop of light from the 1.4L. Both versions of the 35 f2 are a fraction of the cost of the 1.4L, and that's still true. If you're only considering these two lenses, then I'd still say the 35 f2 is really the best value, the best bang for the buck. But if you have or are planning to have the 2470 f2.8 Mark II, then I'd probably skip the 35mm f2 altogether between these two lenses. Why? Because between the 2470 Mark II and the 35 f2, I prefer really everything about the 2470. From the overall look of the bokeh, to the overall contrast, to the color, to the focal length, flexibility, and everything about this, I preferred. I mean, the only difference here was that we got an extra stop of light out of the 35mm 2.0. But from an appearance standpoint, between the 35 f2 and the 2470, there isn't a big enough difference to say merit owning the 35 f2 if you already have or are planning on getting the 2470. So what's the conclusion in the 35mm focal length? Well, there are two lenses that I would choose. Number one, of course, is our 2470. This thing has been awesome from every focal length that we've tested in. For obvious reasons, we choose this because it has a look that's almost as good as a prime. It has amazing contrast, good low light, great color, and it's versatile in being able to go from 24 to 70mm. But the second lens that I would choose for this focal length when paired with the 2470 that's going to give you the best combination of looks and low light capability is going to be the 35 1.4L. Now the 35mm 1.4L is the other lens in this focal length I would consider because it's going to give me 2 additional stops worth of low light performance from f2.8 to 2 to 1.4. That means that I can go again from 1/100th of a second on the f2.8 lens on the 2470 all the way down to 1/400th of a second for shutter speed at f4 on the 35L. In addition, at 1.4, the 35mm provides a much stronger and more noticeable look to the bokeh than the 2470, which will give your images a different look and appeal. So they're a good combination kind of together. But what you need to consider with the 35 1.4L is whether it's the right prime for your shooting style. Well, the focal length is right between basically a 24 prime and the 50 prime. And the 24 is going to be, say, better for landscape and wide angle photography, and the 50mm is going to be better for, say, portraiture. But the 35mm is kind of stuck right in between. And personally, I actually ended up choosing the 50mm 1.2 over the 35mm simply because it's better for portraiture. The focal length is just something that I'm more used to. It makes more sense based on what I'm shooting, and that is portraits. So that's the lens that I selected, and I also have the 24 1.4. But the thing is that the 24 1.4 kind of got replaced when I got the 2470 f2.8. Why? Because again, on the 24, I wasn't shooting wide angle at very low apertures, and I actually found it very frustrating to try and get my focus on the wide angle at very low apertures. So when the 2470 Mark II arrived, then I kind of switched over to this because it had a beautiful look when wide open, not quite as much bokeh, but still awesome, and I generally didn't need that extreme of bokeh or low light performance on my 24 on my wide angle lens. f2.8 was enough. So that's the main consideration when it comes to the 35 is what other lenses are going to complement it with. It is a great complement to the 2470, but what you want to make sure is that it's also a great complement to your other prime lenses. I hope you all enjoyed this conclusion to the 35mm focal length in the SLR Lounge Canon Lens Wars series. Now be sure to check out the article on slrlounge.com by clicking in the link below in the description below the video for more example images, more information on each lens that we present in this video, and for links on where you can purchase. My name is Pye, and I'll see you all in the next episode.